Hi everyone, my name's Rob Parker and I write crime books for grown-ups, and I go all over the country talking to children in schools about writing stories and how much fun it can be. So this one goes out to all my friends that I've met in the primary schools across Warrington, and especially my friends at Holy Cross Primary in Oldham. So if you're struggling for something to do, let's have some fun. Why not build a story together? Should we do that? Okay, let's do it. But I think our theme today should be alternative fairy tales. How does that sound? Let's give it a go. So, how about we do an alternative fairy tale workshop? So, can you think of any fairy tales? What fairy tales immediately spring to mind? Perhaps it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That's a fairy tale. Perhaps it's Cinderella. Perhaps you're thinking of Little Red Riding Hood. Maybe you're thinking about Beauty and the Beast. Perhaps Jack and the Beanstalk. These are all fairy tales, and there's so many of them, isn't there? Maybe you're thinking about Sleeping Beauty. That's definitely a fairy tale. What about Puss in Boots? What about Hansel and Gretel? Now, that's a very famous old fairy tale, that one, isn't it? That's a real classic. What about Rapunzel? Yeah, that's a fairy tale. And what about Rumpelstiltskin? These are all fairy tales. So what do you think of when you think of fairy tales? You know, there's something that all of those fairy tales have got in common, isn't there? Well, when I think of fairy tales, I think of something like, I don't know, it's maybe a castle in the sky, or maybe floating islands full of water that's cascading down, and a huge volcano erupting in the background. Maybe something like that. See, fairy tales cover all sorts of different imagery, don't they? And they're usually so colourful when you think about them. So I was wondering, why do we like them? Why are they so popular? And to start with that, I thought we could look at maybe what the definition of a fairy tale is. So, what is a fairy tale? A fairy tale is a story, often intended for children, that features fanciful and wondrous characters, such as elves, goblins, wizards, and even, but not necessarily, fairies. The term fairy tale seems to refer more to the fantastic and magical setting or magical influences within a story, rather than the presence of the character of a fairy within that story. Fairy tales are often traditional. Many were passed down from storyteller to storyteller before being recorded in books. Interesting. So we know now, we're getting an idea of what fairy tales are about, but what about what types of fairy tales are there? And you can notice these characteristics, and then when you see them you think, this must be a fairy tale I'm reading. So we could look at, perhaps, yes, supernatural adversaries. This would be like Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood, and I love that picture of those cool dragons. Aha, you've got supernatural or enchanted relatives. This would be like Sleeping Beauty and Beauty and the Beast. You know, so when someone in your family perhaps has got magic powers, you're probably in a fairy tale. Aha, who's that? Anyone know who that is? Yep, it's Jiminy Cricket. Jiminy Cricket is in Pinocchio, and he's a supernatural helper. So if you've got a talking sidekick, that's probably a fairy tale you're in. So Cinderella and Puss in Boots, they both got them. Aha, what's this? This is the magic lamp from Aladdin. So, magic objects. Magical objects. If you can make a potion come out of something, it's probably a fairy tale you're in. Aha, who's that? That kind of looks like a wizard, doesn't it? So people with supernatural powers or special knowledge, those definitely are people who would feature in fairy tales. Aha, look at that. That's like that image we started with. A really bright, colourful scene. But this is about tales of fate, isn't it? People who've got a destiny, like Cinderella there. These people and things are often found in fairy tales. So, it's time, I think, for a fresh take. We all know our favourite fairy tales, but we want to make our own fairy tales, don't we? And sometimes I think that the thing that we like about fairy tales is hope, a sense of hope, a sense of being able to change what you've been told or what's expected of you, and doing so in often a magical way. I think that's what fairy tales are really, really about. So why don't we take that and put it in a totally different setting entirely? Perhaps somewhere that you've never imagined a fairy tale could take place in. How about we make, therefore, our own alternative fairy tales? So, well, what does alternative mean? I'll tell you, and we'll go back to a definition for it. Alternative is where of one or more things are available as another possibility or choice, or two, relating to activities that depart from or challenge traditional norms. You see, making something alternative is about making something different. So, if we want to make an alternative fairy tale, we want to make a different kind of fairy tale, a fresh take on a fairy tale. So, how can we apply that idea to write our new, fresh, alternative fairy tales? It's really easy. All you really need to do is take what we know and switch it all up. So I'll show you what I mean. Okay. We'll start with setting. Setting, well, a traditional setting for a fairy tale might be an enchanted wood. Oh, look at it, all the colours, it's beautiful. But in an alternative setting, we could use an abandoned, overrun factory. That looks really cool. I could definitely imagine a fairy tale taking place there. Now, if you look at the characters, you always seem to have a princess, perhaps, don't you? Oh yes, the traditional princess with the long flowing gown and the tiara on her head. Well, what if the princess in an alternative take was actually a zookeeper? Yeah, I think that would be really cool. An alternative fairy tale featuring a zookeeper. That would be good. Now lots of fairy tales seem to have a magic potion. Well, what if our magic potion was not what you would imagine and was actually a big fat hot dog so full that you couldn't get all the stuff on it? What if you ate that and that gave you magic powers? It's all about taking what you know and applying it differently, isn't it, to your fairy tale? Fairy tales often have an evil queen, you know? So there's your evil queen. That's really horrible. But what if, in your story, the evil queen was actually a nasty boss who was always telling you off and telling you what to do all the time? That would still be a fairy tale, wouldn't it? So, how about we make one together? Let's make our own and remember to make it fresh. So, what you want to do now is get a piece of paper. Now you can pause the video if you want to do that, but get a piece of paper and I'm going to ask you some questions, okay? And you write the number of the question on the left hand side and your answer next to it. Now, I love doing this because sometimes it's hard to come up with stories, isn't it? It's hard to come up with an idea just off the top of your head. But if you stop thinking about that and start thinking about what every story in the world has got, what's every story got? The answer is character. If you start thinking about character and not worrying about story, the story pops out of that character. I'll show you what I mean. So, I like to untwist the top of my head and pour everything out so there's nothing in there at all, because you know what you're doing, you know how clever you are, you know all about stories, you've got stories around you all the time, you know just what you're doing, so trust your instincts, okay? So, question 1, an answer with the first thing that pops into your head. We'll look at our character first. So, write down a name. What's the name of your main character? And it could be anything. Put it down and don't worry about crossing it out later. Because if you cross it out later, every time you scrub something out, you're going to put something better in its place. So, do it. Write down any name. Any name. Okay? Got that? Now write an age. Write the age next. Whatever that might be. Any number, write it down. Remember, you can change it later. Okay? Now a place. Put down a place. Now remember, we're doing things slightly differently. So, think about a different place for a fairy tale to take place in. Get it down. All right, next up is their role in life. So this person there who you've answered 3 questions about, what is their role in life? Could be a job. Are they in school? What do they do with their time? Think about that. And remember, you can change it at any time as well. Now, I think that most of the best fairy tales feature secrets. So, your character there, and I bet in your head you've got a pretty good picture of your character emerging already, and all you've done is ask 4 little questions. But what is their deepest secret? What do they wish no one would ever find out about them? What is it? What is it? What do they want to keep hidden forever? Have a think and write it down. Okay? What about now? Let's think about, there's always something in a fairy tale that people are trying to achieve. So what is your character trying to achieve? What is their ultimate goal? What is it they want to do? Now think about their role in life, think about where they are, and what is it they want to achieve? What do they want to get done? Don't think too hard on it, just write down the first thing that pops into your head. Okay? So let's take a look now at the world, because all fairy tales happen in always interesting places, don't they? And I always like that, always like that. So let's have a look at the world we're going to place this in. Where are we precisely? Now remember, the answer to question 3 in the last section was a general place, wasn't it? Well, now let's answer with a bit more precision. Let's say exactly where we are. And if you have to change any answers to get this what you want it to be, do so. Get it changed. This is your story. It can be whatever you want it to be. So, you've got that? Now let's think about a time frame. When is this happening? Lots of fairy tales tend to take place in the past, but we're making our own alternative fresh takes, aren't we? So where do you want yours to be? Can be any time you want, any time in history. Think about it. Okay, you got something down? Usually those places that we talk about have got some kind of risk. They've got some kind of danger. What dangers are there in the place that you've just set up? What could go wrong there? What is going wrong there? What's happening? Think about it. Don't worry, you can change it later or add to it if you want. So let's have a look at the story itself. Now remember, we're talking about fairy tales, aren't we? And fairy tales usually start with something fantastic happening or magical happening to kick things off. So we know what your character is. What happens that kickstarts the action? What magical event gets this story going? Write something down. You can change it later. Just get thinking. So, stories have, well, I like to keep stories really simple. And stories usually have 3 little bits to it, don't they? And we're not talking about things like title or, anything complicated. We're just thinking about what bits are in a story. And usually there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And everything's got to start somewhere. So, what happens in the beginning of your story? Write down a little line about what's happening in the beginning. Maybe it's the introduction to your character. Maybe we find out who they are and where they are and what the problem is. That's usually a good place to start, especially in a fairy tale. You need to set things up, don't you? So, get something down. Now, when you've done that, what's next? Well, usually you might say the middle, but I like to forget all that, because if I just go from the beginning straight into the middle, and this is me, when writing my books, I tend to get lost because I don't really know where I'm going. So I tend to look at the end instead. Forget the middle. So, what happens at the end? Because if you've got the beginning and you've got the end, you can't really get lost, can you? You know where you're going all the time because you know you're heading somewhere. Whereas if you just start in the middle, you get lost in all the rubbish, all the story strands, and you don't really know where you're going. So what happens at the end? Does your character achieve their goal? Do they get what they want? Is it a happy ending, a sad ending, a shocking ending? What kind of ending are we talking about? Get something down. Remember, You can change your ending later because this is your story. So, now we've got the beginning, we've got the end. What do we need? The middle. So, write down what happens in the middle of your story. And that can be just as simple as what happens from there to there. Because this is about the journey, isn't it? This is where the action happens. This is where the story takes its turns. Make a couple of little notes. What goes on? What happens? So, once you've done that, I think you should look at the moral of the story. Because in my head, every single story has, fairy tale story, has a moral to it, you know? So what is the moral of your story that you should remember while you're writing it? Now there's one last thing we need to make sure that this is a proper story, and that's title. Now it's time for a title. If I'd have asked you this at the very beginning, you wouldn't have known what to say. But you know all about the story now. So, what are you going to call it? Have a think. So, you've got everything there. You've got yourself, if you've written down answers to all those questions, you've got yourself a worksheet right there in front of you, which you can go and build your own alternative fairy tale to. So, why don't you go and have a go? It doesn't have to be long. It can be as long as you like. But go and have fun. Remember, stories are supposed to be fun and they're supposed to be exciting, and it's supposed to be so much fun and joy writing stories. So go out there and enjoy yourself, okay? And keep safe and keep smiling, okay? Take care. Bye-bye.